Alrighty, I think we'll go ahead and start. Thank you everyone for joining our webinar today. My name is Alla Al-Dalati. I am a simulation fellow at Brown. I did my training at Mayo in emergency medicine. I'm so excited to be here. I'll introduce my co-host, Christina Matulis. Go ahead, Christina, and tell them a little about yourself.
I'm I'm a current simulation fellow at Yale, and I did my residency at Brown. And I'm currently serving on the executive committee as the fellow this year. And one of our goals is to increase just access to simulation in general for residents and medical students. And our hope is to provide some mentorship. And so I'll let Alla describe a bit more about our goals of the session tonight, but we're really excited that you're all here.
Awesome. So our this is Navigating the Fellowship webinar, which basically it's aimed for people who are interested in simulation fellowship. As you all know, simulation fellowships are not ACGME regulated, so they vary between different institutes. Some of fellowships focus more about VR versus some of them more about like other modalities. The basics are the same. However, there are multiple options out there. And when I was applying for simulation fellowship, I was like, I'm not sure what I want to do, and I'm not sure how to compare these fellowships, and I'm not sure how would my career look like 10 or 15 years from now. I had all these questions, and I thought maybe it's a good idea to do a webinar for our residents who are considering simulation fellowship or simulation as a future career. We have a wonderful list of panels today that some of them joined at the last minute. I really appreciate their time. Those are all seasoned simulationists, been doing this for a long time, definitely more than me. And we're happy that they're able to join us. I'll let you guys introduce yourselves. I'll go one by one and let you talk about your interests and what you do. I'll start with Susie.
Great. Hi. Everybody hears me. Good. All right. Well, first off, happy Doctor's Day, because that's huge and an exciting time that this happened to coincide with. But I'm Susie Bentley. Thanks for the intro. Happy to be here with all of you. I am the current secretary of the Simulation Academy and the president-elect. I'm an EM physician at New York City Health and Hospitals. I did fellowship at Mount Sinai, which is half at Sinai and half at Elmhurst, and then fell in love with Elmhurst and stayed. I did a simulation fellowship at Health and Hospitals, which we can get into details of after, and then started our hospital-wide simulation center in 2014 after being the residency program director, moved totally into sim. And now I'm the director of simulation research and innovation for our health system. And also, interestingly, the chief wellness officer of our hospital. So I've had a very, it's all unified by debriefing, but a kind of twisty career that's a little bit atypical, but it's been an adventure. So that's me, happy to be here with you. And my real passion with sim is probably Insight to Sim and sim for systems assessment and improvement, as well as, all things sim.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Bentley, for being here today. Really appreciate your time. Let's move to Dr. Ian Julie.
Hi there. My name is Ian Julie. I am a simulation fellow graduate at UC Davis, and I ended up from there going on to direct our fellowship and then our simulation center here at our health system. My training was in New York City. I was at Kings County and spent a lot of time in the center for the HHC group, which I remember very fondly and kind of sparked my interest in this. Coming out to California was a big decision, and that's kind of why I got invited to this panel. I'm the only West Coaster who was willing to talk on a beautiful day. But coming out to California is a difficult move for anybody in academia, and looking for fellowships in this region was a big part of my motivation to come to UC Davis, which ended up being a wonderful choice. So very happy to talk about our programs, about the process of getting involved, about the whole thing going on with accreditation, some management stuff related to sim, and then careers for our fellows, because our fellowship has been going on for, I want to say, since 2010. And we have quite a few graduates in quite a few different positions, both in academia and in the private sector. So thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Julie, for your time. We really appreciate it. And then we'll move to Dr. Stephanie Cohen.
Hi guys, I'm Stephanie Cohen. I'm probably not as seasoned as anybody else. I'm very new. I went to residency at the University at Buffalo, and I was in residency at the height of COVID when things in the job market were very different than they were before that. So my original plan was actually not to do a fellowship, so I did not take the traditional route. And then I decided that I loved to teach and wanted to do academics. And so that's when I decided to pursue a simulation fellowship. I did fellowship at Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville, Florida, and I am now the simulation director at University of Central Florida in Orlando. My first year out.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're looking forward to hear more about the non-traditional route to simulation. All righty, we'll move last but not least to Dr. Michael Rance.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. My name is Mike. I am a current simulation EM fellow at University of Wisconsin at Madison. I did my training in Rush University in Chicago. So just, I guess, bringing a little bit of some Midwestern perspective, but to piggyback off of Stephanie, even less experienced in terms of the full simulation experience, but just happy to try and share my perspective as someone who is a current fellow right now, who's kind of navigated through residency and also through COVID, kind of envisioning the future career prospects and what a career in simulation might look like. And then I'm also I'm going to be working at a medical college of Wisconsin in Milwaukee after I graduate from fellowship in Madison this year. So just any concerns or questions that you guys have as applicants or people who are beginning their curiosity or their search into going into a fellowship, just happy to give any perspective, and thanks again for the invite.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. So before we start with questions, I would like to ask all the participants just to write next to your name, like what tier are you? Are you at a faculty? Are you a resident, med student? Just write it next to your name so we know. And then feel free to use the chat to ask any questions. We do have prepared set of questions that we received beforehand from you guys, and we're going to ask them. But if you have any more questions, just make sure you use the chat. All right, I'll pass the mic to Christina.
Awesome. Thanks, Ala. And thank you, everyone, for your introductions. I think we have a great panel of speakers tonight who can provide a variety of perspectives on all things simulation. And as Ala said, we definitely want to make this worth your time for showing up. So certainly any specific questions you have, put them in the chat, because even if they seem like silly questions, they're not. And we want to be able to help you as best we can. Personally in residency, I, similar to Ala, didn't know all that much about what simulation fellowships entailed, and kind of started the process a bit later in my third year, which was fine, but I think it would have been great to have a little bit more insight earlier on. So we're hoping to provide that to you. But we'll start with just some general questions that I'll open up to our panel. And if someone wants to jump in and answer, that would be helpful. So I think one of the general questions we have is just like, what does the simulation fellowship entail? Because it's not necessarily a standardized fellowship, sometimes people want to know a bit more, like, are there kind of overarching themes? What can you expect to be doing on a day-to-day basis during a simulation fellowship?
So I can speak for what I've seen from graduates from multiple programs. Every university is different, and a lot of the programs will have different simulation projects going on and different affiliations for their simulation center. So one of the first things you're going to want to figure out is, what is the fellowship director and the overall emergency department's role in whatever center the fellowship is based in. Some will be working on medical students, some will be working almost exclusively with residents within their program, some will be working with residents in multiple programs, others will be working with hospital-based staff. Ideally, you'll get a mix of all of that sort of thing, but it's going to vary between institutions. So the way most of the programs, at least out west, are structured is you have an academic day where you do some simulation kind of in situ, you do some journal club work, you do some projects that you're working on, usually 1 day a week, which is kind of similar to a lot of other fellowships in many ways. And then there's larger projects that become quite involved, usually involving resident education days. At our institution, we're involved in about 8 to 10 of those a year, and then have a variety of different projects that our fellows do, some based on their interest and some based on longstanding work that we've done as a center throughout the rest of the year.
I
Awesome.
think
Thank you.
from just from my perspective, yeah, I would just piggyback off of that as well. I think that from the Midwestern programs that I interviewed at, and then additionally the one that I'm currently at University of Wisconsin, like the kind of day-to-day or week-to-week or month-to-month activities that you'd be involved with are really, like Ian was saying, is one kind of focused around your core group of learners. So for me, I have kind of a standing responsibility to be responsible for creating and facilitating the simulations for the emergency medicine residency. But that also includes any other projects that the Associated Medical School will have as well. So it's sort of my pick of things. So from a kind of practical standpoint, a lot of your duties are going to be in creating and debriefing sims, because that's kind of the backbone of your education and the types of skills that you want to be developing. But then additionally, they will have some associated other projects, kind of other extracurricular activities, either if they're in education research, quality improvement, other like peer faculty development. So if there's some sort of scholarly project journey that will be kind of required as part of your own education, your graduation, in addition to your simulation facilitation duties as well.
Awesome, thank you. And then I think one other thing I might highlight is that focuses a lot on the simulation aspect. And while it's not standardized at many places or most places, you'll also be working clinically in the emergency department. So that has been a nice balance to the simulation work and getting to work for me, both at our big center at Yale, but also at another more community site where I get to work a bit more independently. So it's nice to get to work with a lot of the residents that I work with on a day-to-day basis in SIM and get to work with them clinically and vice versa. But those things will all differ a little bit depending where you go. So just kind of asking about that can be helpful.
And if I can just build on all of that, also really asking, what capstone projects the fellows have done before. And if you see themes, you can kind of know how big or how small that requirement or how serious that project requirement is, and how many faculty they have, especially if you have a specific interest. And I'll also just say most of the fellowships, I think the huge majority, are EM physician focused. Ours is unique and it's not the only one, but it's actually completely interdisciplinary. So we have 12 to 15 fellows a year because it's a health, it's a health system fellowship. So we have 11 acute care hospitals. And we even have taken, non-clinical staff from patient experience that have done a lot with communication simulation. There's always physicians, nurses, respiratory therapists together, which I think is a very cool setup because you will still work in the emergency department as a physician, but it does open up the exposure that you get to SIM, which based on if you have a goal in mind of where you'd like to go with it, may potentially open up more doors, because maybe you want to immediately go into, running a hospital-wide program, or maybe there's a need for someone to also cross over and do more nursing or interprofessional. I think all SIM fellowships definitely have an interprofessional training component, no matter what, for sure, because I think, any responsible SIM program is definitely doing more than just physician siloed SIM at this point, but just something to think about. There are some of these atypical kind of outlier programs too.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off of that. Mayo is one of those. There's no EM residency at Mayo in Jacksonville. I did work in the emergency department, but as a sim fellow, we did a lot of interdisciplinary everything and actually learned how to run a sim center. So there's a lot of different aspects of sim that you can kind of ask about during your interviews if you want to be involved with. If one day you're looking, I know we think all EM, but if you're looking one day to like run a sim center, then you want to be able to be in that aspect as well on the admin side.
Christina, you're muted.
Sorry, kind of general question. We talked about kind of what does a simulation fellowship entail, but another question that commonly comes up is just why should I consider a simulation fellowship? Like, is it necessary to do a fellowship now? Can I do simulation work without a fellowship? What kind of additional benefits that I get? So if anyone can speak to that, that would be great.
I'll speak to that really quickly. So as I said, I was non-traditional and I wasn't planning on doing a fellowship at first. And then COVID hit and the job market was very different. I always wanted to teach. I always wanted to do academics, and I always thought I could do that without doing a fellowship. I think that culture has kind of changed. And I think that in the future, you kind of need a niche if you want to get into academics. I think especially with all these freestandings opening, from my perspective as a newer employee and a newer attending, if you want to go academics, you probably should consider a fellowship, because I don't really know what the future years will bring. That's my perspective. I think when I was applying for jobs, I was cold emailing programs and getting responses from pretty much all the programs that I emailed when I said that I was in a simulation fellowship. So I would say if you want to do academics, it's something to strongly consider.
Yeah, I think, and beyond academics too, it's good to have a niche in your career. If you know people who've been practicing emergency medicine for more than a decade, eventually you get kind of tired working a million clinical shifts, which is a wonderful thing, but it's even better if you can balance it with something else that really piques your interest. So simulation is one of those things that every hospital system, any place that you're going to end up working, is going to have some desire for, because it can be really well integrated into onboarding, education, and CME, quality improvement, all kinds of stuff that just give you another avenue to explore, which is both a fun thing to do to keep your life interesting and fresh, but also give you an opportunity to find time that's compensated by whatever organization you work for, that doesn't have to be spent really moving patients through. And having that kind of balance, whatever that ratio is for you, whether it's 10% or 25% or 50% of your time doing something other than pure clinical work, is a godsend for a good career and life balance down the line. Plus, it's just, it's fun. You get to interact with other learners of various stripes, and that becomes a real impetus for you to keep up on literature and keep learning from the people you're interacting with. It's just a nice kind of thing.
And I agree completely. I would just say also, if you think you want to do SIM and you want to do education, but in the community, I would also strongly advise, building on Stephanie's point about, getting behind the glass, getting formal education on equipment and running it and doing all of the roles. That's something that you will definitely get at a very strong program as a resident, but not in the way you'll get it over the course of a fellowship. So if you ever could envision a role that you might want to take that doesn't have formal SIM and it'll be you, I would say beyond the street cred you get, perhaps with saying you're fellowship trained, there is a skill set that comes from the dedicated training that I don't think you could, ever match just in a strong residency setting with SIM.
I definitely agree with everything that was said and don't have a whole lot more to add, except just that, in terms of the skill set itself, I think there's, maybe even among some of the, older academic physicians or other people who are involved with education, that it's maybe a little bit easier said than done to be able to incorporate simulation and do it competently at a level that is kind of being required of residency programs or medical schools nowadays. So at least for me personally, I think that, the skill set that I'm learning is I think very very robust in terms of the kind of educational components, the technical components. There's just an enormous amount that I didn't even really know about even before fellowship that goes into being an effective simulationist. And so I think that it would be of enormous benefit to you if you want to be someone who's an expert or a specialist to be able to do a fellowship just like this, just like you might do for ultrasound. You know, I think for lots of different fellowships, you don't necessarily have to do the fellowship to be, you know, semi-competent and be able to do it, you know, similar to ultrasound or EMS or things like that, to have at least a kind of a novice interest. But if you really want to kind of go the next level and have the kind of a marketable higher career function to it, it's really been great for me, and I'm sure others here will attest the same thing. I think for me, it's kind of also bridging that sort of emotional component with the more practical component of it. Emotionally saying, like, your backbone is you recognize as someone who says, I like education, I like teaching, and I want to do those sorts of things long term. That's great. But sort of everyone can kind of teach. So you want to get that kind of as your bedrock, but then beyond that, taking that bridge, that step next that says, how can I kind of practically turn this interest into an actual job? And then that's, I think, where fellowship comes into really giving you that formalized training and makes you very marketable for actual careers.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. So we have some great questions in the chat that I want to get to in a few minutes, but I'm just going to ask a few more of the general kind of logistic questions we had first and then dive into these a little bit more. So one question that came up when we sent out a pre-survey was just if, what are our thoughts on 1 versus 2 year programs? Because I think that's a common question that comes up when residents are searching for simulation programs. And I think tied into that as a secondary question is, you know, what are the, like, is it necessary to do an advanced degree during a simulation fellowship? What are the pros and cons of doing that? So if anyone can speak to that, that'd be very helpful. And even, I know that you're doing a 2 year fellowship as well, so your perspective would be great.
I did a 2 year fellowship, and now I have some great initials. Master's in Advanced Study in Clinical Research. So it's MD-MAS, which I always have to explain to people, and I find kind of hilarious. That's about most of what I get out of it because I'm a terrible scientist. I did it because it was interesting, because I was advised to do it by somebody I trusted very deeply, and because you know, I thought that going down the research route would be valuable. It really is something that you want to pursue if you have a strong interest in true academia and in research science. In that case, you should look for a program that has an affiliation with some sort of master's of some sort. If you are not interested in doing that, though, it is a lot of time to put into something and a lot of money that you use as a result of having taken another year of kind of half attending salary at best. So it's a tough decision to make. The one thing that I would add that can be a factor is if you're going for a new geographic location or to really put yourself in a new system or career path coming out, it is something to consider, because one thing that I've noticed over the last couple of years, having many 2 year and many 1 year fellows, is the 1 year fellows are starting their career, like their job search, in essentially August of their fellowship, which is really challenging. They have nothing to show for their fellowship so far. They haven't gotten a project off the ground. They're just getting oriented to their. It's a very hard thing to take that and stay at the place where you're doing your fellowship, or even to start a academic career without really much to show for what you've done so far.
I would agree with Ian. I initially thought I want to do a 1 year fellowship, and then I reconsidered and doing a 2 year fellowship with Masters in Medical Education and Leadership. Reasons behind my decisions were, the first thing, it's hard to find the job immediately after, like after residency. I just started a fellowship. I'm just trying to figure out, I'm just having my attending legs under me, and then now I need to find a job, know what I'm looking for in a career, which was a little bit challenging. It's also, if you're not doing your fellowship and where you train, it's hard to move geographic areas every year. That's a little bit challenging. That's another thing. And I love academia. I love teaching. I want to have a niche in that. And I love research as well. I don't have much experience in that. So I decided I was like, might as well just do a master's. Maybe it's not a great factor to play in my decision, but my masters were paid by my fellowship program. So that was an advantage. I was like, I'm missing out if I'm not taking this master's.
Oh, yeah. Make sure you know that ahead of time. And that should be the case for any fellowship you join in on. My goodness.
All right. I think Christian in the chat asked actually the same question that I was going to pose to the group after this, about kind of further logistic questions, as if we could elaborate on the general timeline for applying for simulation fellowships. It seems programs don't all operate on the same timeline for applications and interviews. I'll actually share my experience, and then if anyone else wants to kind of jump in, but as someone who recently applied to simulation fellowship, I guess at the end of my third year, I didn't have too much guidance in the timing of it. And so I think that surprised me a little bit. But I did reach out and connect with kind of fellowship directors just via kind of cold email to learn about the program starting around this time of my third year. I have to remind myself now because they kind of blend together, the different years. And then I formally applied over the summer, and many of the applications had sort of a rolling submission date. And I kind of waited until later in the summer, and I realized I maybe should have just applied to them right away, as I know they start reviewing them early. And then many of the interviews, we were still dealing with the pandemic. So a lot of them, they were all virtual interviews, but those took place, I believe, in like the September range. And so between that and early fall, kind of the timing of ASAP seemed to be when a lot of that happened during my year. I'm not sure, maybe Ian, if that's changed for you for looking at applications for future cycles, but that was sort of the like summer and early fall seemed to be the time frame that most programs seem to stick to.
Yeah, we like to see applications start rolling in the summertime and then arrange them for August, September, October, and then have a decision out between, as earliest is kind of Halloween and then latest would be Thanksgiving. But it is quite variable at this point. So you got to talk to whatever institutions you're interviewing at about their potential timeline. And then there's, occasions where it gets a little competitive as a result of those variabilities.
I think, yeah, as someone who, again, just is in current fellowship, so applied last year, I think the whole process itself is a little bit of a hybrid between what you would expect for kind of the stress and competitiveness and time frame for applying for residency, where it's all kind of a match system. So it's all kind of on rails on a very equitable schedule and kind of takes care of itself and doesn't require a whole lot of organization on your part, versus applying for just a general career after graduation, which is kind of a Wild West, like all bets are off sort of picture, where you're essentially there's patterns and kind of seasons for like when people will be hired, especially when everyone is graduating at a certain time or whatnot. But the fellowship process, at least for something like this where it's unaccredited and there's multiple different programs, is just sort of something in between, where there is a very real kind of practical aspect to what it seems like you're asking, which is that there will very likely be situations in which you will be applying to certain programs and will not have heard back from other programs, or even more dramatically, you may be like a front runner or having shown high interest for a certain program and you haven't even heard back from another one yet. So I don't think there's really a very easy or kind of rote way of explaining how to manage that, except just kind of using your best judgment and trying to communicate with programs as much as you're able to, especially if you have a very high interest in a certain program versus others, being able to let programs know that upfront. And then I also totally agree with what Christina had as kind of her plan for applying for programs, which is that you just want to reach out, even cold calling early as much as you can, to try and get an impression of what that time frame will be, and then anticipate kind of what your strategy for applying to different programs is going to be, so you don't get caught flat-footed. It's one of the kind of nice things is that, you know, everybody who has a simulation fellowship is looking to fill that spot, as opposed to maybe some community spots or other jobs where, you know, you cold call them and they maybe aren't looking for you. So you have that on your side, that people want to talk to you. So you should absolutely reach out to the programs, and I'm sure they will attest that, you know, they're happy to hear from you and will give you any information that you need for the timeframes.
Yeah, and I'll just echo what Mike said about, you know, it is very rolling, but if you will definitely likely have a mismatch in when you're hearing from places. So if you have somewhere you really, really want to be, but they may not be deciding, you know, I would reach out again. I would want to hear from someone before they took another offer because they were worried, you know, that they were still waiting. Because, you know, things happen and timelines can shift based on who it is. So reaching out and establishing that early too also shows the interest and the motivation versus just kind of waiting like some people do. And then sometimes, you know, I get emails after the deadlines have passed and I feel very bad. But like at that, you know, at that point, it's just like too late, started too late. So.
And I think if my fellowship year, but especially my role in SAEM this year has taught me anything, that the simulation community is a pretty small community. And so I think that's great in many ways for collaboration, but just, you know, everyone wants everyone to succeed, but I would advocate for just, you know, being open and honest about, you know, your timeframes, that sometimes priorities might switch as you're applying, especially, you know, if you're navigating a move or career like change with a partner or something like that. And so I think, you know, connecting early with programs, you know, even now, just to learn a bit more, perhaps talking with the fellows at the program too, to hear about their experience and even the timeline that they experienced. And when you're in that kind of mismatch of maybe you hear an offer, you're holding out for another program, just kind of being, you know, respectful and professional, just like you were during the match period too.
I'm a little bit biased, but I absolutely love that idea of reaching out to the fellows and seeing kind of what their perspective is. I personally would, you know, love to hear from anybody about kind of what they want to do. I remember being in your very situation, if you are applying for fellowship, and kind of working with very, very limited information, depending on who you've been chatting with, and even kind of knowing what the geographic landscape of what it means to practice sim in different parts of the country. So the more people you can talk to, I think that the better. And a current sim fellow is just, I think, the perfect person who can kind of be on your side to give you a little bit of an unbiased perspective without looking like you're, you know, asking inappropriate questions or wanting to try and understand, you know, this really serious decision that you're going to be making. So by all means, if you guys have any questions, I'm sure all the fellows are happy to talk with you.
I got a question.
And I would just,
yeah, go ahead, Sam.
No, I was going to say, I would just point out a little bit different than the match, where I know there's like all sorts of rules and professionalism concerns about reaching out and, you know, what you can say, what programs can say and not say. There are still professionalism rules with this, but it is not regulated the way the match is in terms of reaching out. So, you know, cold out of the blue emailing a director or a fellow and saying you're interested and things like that is a little bit more fair game. Just to point that out, because I know around the match, I was advised very strongly to not reach out, you know, kind of out of the cycle of different things. So this is definitely a small community and much less formal.
All right, Christian, I
And
think
go ahead, whoever had a question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask for those who do sim more in a community environment, what that kind of looks like. And my bias is, you know, I'm at Rush, and so, you know, it's a medical school and a residency and a sim fellowship there, and so it's more academic. So all my exposure to sim is just the academic med student resident kind of sim, but I'm curious what, you know, more community sim looks like, and more the interdisciplinary, like, you know, working with other professions and stuff looks like.
I can speak to this in a hybrid kind of answer because we do sim supporting both the Rikers Island Jail, which community of sorts, as well as some of our community sites and clinics for different special populations around New York City. And I would tell you that it is much more usually incident initiated. So, noticing a trend in things that aren't going well, or a sentinel event that happens, with a high acuity, low occurrence procedure, OBs being probably a big one. We've been asked to go support deliveries in emergency departments that are freestanding that don't have OB, for example, which I guess is a community setting, but with an affiliation. So things like that. And then it's much more just the team that is there in that complement, and a little bit less, you still have your objectives, everything is still rigorous, but it's not, necessarily research. It's much more tied to looking at their system, teaching them, and kind of seeing where the fallouts are, I would say. And then, some has been sponsored by insurance companies in the community where they give money for SIM, and they may not have, a robust SIM program, but their SIM person will then do it with whatever equipment or reach out to partners. So again, not a pure answer because I'm not in a real community setting, but that would be what I would say. It's a little less of a structured curriculum. In my experience, it's much more based on a root cause analysis or something that happened that didn't go well.
Yeah, and let me just add that one of the few places where everybody has money is risk management. And that is what the simulation folks in the community end up doing. If they see the potential to decrease their liability, well, actually, back a decade or so ago is just like the textbook example of it, but it happens in all kinds of different avenues. Like you said, OB is a huge one, but there's a million for a million different healthcare systems. So it is a nice source of a potential career, and also very fun.
And I also will add, just anecdotally, that I know several examples of grads that we've had that have gone to the community and they've had SIM experience, either had done a whole fellowship and then graduated from our fellowship, or even straight residents that did SIM with us, that then with their one mannequin have been able to meet a need from risk management. And it's actually opened the door for them to become the SIM person, in one case for the entire community hospital, because that was the introduction that they needed to see kind of how valuable it can be. And then with their expertise, they were able to pitch, all of the ways that you could do everything better with SIM, but a lot more, not waiting for something bad to happen and then try to play catch up. So like I said, I do believe that risk is often how maybe SIM gets its foot in the door, or some visibility in those settings. But it's an exciting opportunity if someone with SIM training is there, to then be able to really just continue. You can run with it, go anywhere with it, because the need obviously exists.
I think your question is excellent in that it kind of hits on the fact that there are just so many different things that you can do with simulation after you graduate to make it kind of a marketable career interest. And so again, obviously without a whole lot of experience, but also anecdotally, just like Susie was saying, like there's sort of, almost, if you're going to the community common, an entrepreneurial aspect to it, in that you could potentially work with as little as your own sim mannequin, or just using in situ sims, versus entering a place that has an already fully established simulation center. So just to piggyback, to say that I think an enormous part of what your duties of working in a possible community site would be, depending a little bit on what their resources and what their need are, but also a little bit in the skill set that you bring, and in the marketability and way in which you're sort of able to sell yourself to provide new resources or new skills or new quality improvement or risk management or what have you. It's a little bit, if you can imagine yourself as providing a service with SIM and solving a certain SIM, or solving a certain problem with SIM, then it's sort of up to your imagination and their willingness to hire you to be able to do those things.
And there are also opportunities like even outside of community medicine. So when I was at Mayo, we were near Cape Canaveral. I'm not going to name any names, but I did set up sims for aerospace medicine. And actually went to the launch pad and launch site and triage sites and set up sims there. So there are lots of opportunities to do really cool things that aren't just in a sim center when you do sim.
Yeah, lots of opportunities with EMS roles, if that is something that's interesting. I've seen a lot of people transition into, directorships with that, where they're in the in the ED, but then they're also doing sim with that. And then there's also the huge avenue around global health, if that is something that interests you, because having the skill set, much like Mike said, you don't even need a mannequin. It's really what you learn about how you set up a case just with anybody on the bed, and how you debrief it. But, a lot of third world countries, that will be mind-blowing education. And it's not the gold standard, obviously, there, because they don't have the resources, but it's another huge skill set. And global health is getting, I won't say saturated, but, lots of people are doing it now. It's its own fellowship. So SIM is, again, another specific skill set that's very marketable if you want to get onto someone's grant or go to an institution that will buy some of your time to travel and go abroad and teach and practice EM.
And just one more thing that I didn't realize before I went into sim fellowship, debriefing is really an art. I feel like before you go into sim, you don't realize what you get out of debriefing. So we're talking about like building cases, and we're talking about all the stuff you do in simulation. I feel like one of the really marketable things about being a simulationist is being able to debrief and being able to really bring together the points and the education. It really goes far, not just in simulation, but also in like feedback to residents on shift and communication with people outside of medicine. So I think that that's like one of the huge things in sim that I took away is the debriefing, which we talk about a lot, but you don't really realize how hard it is until you get into it.
All right, just going through the other questions in the chat. Another one to discuss is medical education included in a 2-year sim fellowship, or is it a different fellowship? And I guess, a question I feel like that does often come up is sort of like, why medical education fellowship versus a simulation fellowship?
I would say that you will get a different answer, I bet, if you ask med ed fellowship directors than necessarily sim directors. But my bias, which I'm admitting is my bias, is I think that you get majority of a med ed fellowship when you compare curricula, whatever the plural would be, between the two. But obviously you get very, much more limited simulation exposure in a medical education fellowship. So my personal bias is that I think you can go into medical education, residency, DME, med school, any of the above, whether or not you're using SIM, because you'll learn, a huge amount of this theory and other things if you're at a SIM program with a very, structured curriculum. But I'm sure, pros and cons of both, but I think you get a day of SIM probably in med ed fellowships compared to it being the focus. But again, we all love SIM, so that's my answer, again, with my bias, that I think SIM is fantastic.
We kind of had thought a lot about that at our institution. I went through my simulation fellowship without enough med ed directed time. And my colleague who had done a medical education fellowship ended up being the guy who really taught me all of that stuff after the fact, which was kind of a bummer for any education project I was trying to put together. We had a lot of people coming through our program asking about the balance between those two things, whether to do sim, whether to do med ed, lap is there between the two. And we decided at our institution to merge those programs. We've had some people come through who have a very, very strong interest in medical education without the simulation component, and they've all seemed to benefit from doing the time with sim to debrief. They've just had projects that have gone in other directions involving physical exam skills or, I don't know, tests or some nonsense. But the amount of education work that they've done as related to doing simulation was really exceptional. So all of them kind of liked it in the end. So what I will summarize with is that you need a medical education background to do simulation. It should be built into your simulation curriculum for any fellowship you have. If you are a specialist, you may be able to get away with doing an ed fellowship without much simulation time, but it's such an ubiquitous tool now in healthcare that any lack of exposure to it is really going to cost you in the end. So unless you have a very specific interest where you really want to be in a field that's very non-simulation related, I would try to find a fellowship program in sim where med ed is emphasized and feel that you'll get more out of it in terms of your long-term trajectory that way.
And I think to build on that, it really speaks to, asking, if you can even just see the curriculum outline, asking, a great question, I think, is what the split is in the hours or the sim days between dedicated teaching and education days compared to just days in the sim lab, because you will learn. And, again, even asking the fellows, probably more than the directors, but, like, what's the oversight like when I'm on my sim days? As somebody with a lot of, oh my God, I love Ian's backdrop of a child, keeping it real. What is the oversight? What is the supervision? Because if again, it's kind of like in residency, the service education balance. If you are going to become their EM resident sim person, but not have a seasoned faculty member there to debrief your debriefing and give you feedback on your sims, especially early on, you will not get as much out of it. So places that are like, no, all we do is really sim and then you learn as you go, could be fantastic. But for me, I would really value kind of looking at how they structure the curriculum and how much is around med ed and theory, because even though, yeah, it's boring, none of us, want to do that. We all want to be in the sim center. I think it's really hugely important for both sim and med ed and any role you're going to go into after this. So I would ask those questions, because things, 10 years ago were a lot less formal and they were a lot more kind of winging it, and you were learning, the apprenticeship kind of way more. But now most places are really very structured and they can tell you exactly, what's covered and also who's teaching it. Because if there are content experts coming in, you should be getting QI formal experience. You should be getting medical education theory. Again, some of it, yeah, may sound boring, but that's how you're gonna, build on the skills to understand, even if you never want to do research, but kind of why are you teaching it the way you're teaching it? How are you designing cases? Things like that.
So I'm trying to make sure we answer all of our questions in the chat. So I think we're wrapping up in a few minutes. So if you have any last lingering questions, I would put them in the chat, and we'll certainly put our emails in the chat too, so that if you want to reach us directly for additional questions, we can help with those. One of the other questions I think had been earlier, just if anyone could share any specific projects that they're working on during their sim fellowship or worked on during their sim fellowship, or perhaps projects that you've seen recent grads do, just to share an idea of what someone could accomplish during a sim fellowship.
I would say that projects have really run the gamut from being, IRB approved, very formal studies to being, much more scholarship. We obviously, everyone at our program, is matched with a mentor. So hopefully, at a minimum, you're creating something that can go to MedEd portal or somewhere where you're getting, credit and you can present it. But really, I think that the most robust, successful projects are often informed by a match of your interest and what you like and are excited about, and also what the need is of the department or the hospital where you are, so that you have the, the buy-in to do something in a robust way, be it with risk management's buy-in or nurses buy-in. So, anything from sepsis management to handoffs with EMS, trying to think of other things. People have covered cognitive load and trauma, kind of covered the gamut, really, whatever people needed. And a lot of them sometimes are reinventing the wheel and just looking at something that maybe has been published extensively, but in a different way. to get this skill set, and that's what interests them, or that's what the issue is. So not everything has to become, you know, a multi-site study when you're in fellowship. But again, really just for the experience of making sure you take it from start to finish. And you're super mentor, you know, really getting mentorship through the steps as you do it. Other people have exciting projects, capstones to share.
I've seen a lot of process validation work over the years. I tried to do an airway milestone related thing. It went about as well as the milestones do. Let's see, what else did we have? We've had people do minor procedure related ones. Those are always really valuable. So something you feel like has not been taught properly and that there's no model for, that you want to build and validate and create a curriculum for, is super fun. Generally speaking, it has to be informed, like you were saying, by something that motivates you, but also fills a gap. And again, this is where that med ed kind of thing comes in. You have to do a needs assessment ahead of time. You have to identify the problem that you're going to address and then really have an objective to meet. Getting that down, though, with pretty much anything that interests you is possible. The question is, how far are you going to take it? And the answer really varies by program. Some places want you to come up with at least a scholarly publication ready to go. It doesn't necessarily have to be published. Other places would just want you to produce some work that you can show off at the end of the year. But in general, it's got to be based on whatever interests you. And if you find you're being handed off somebody else's project to complete or to do something that you don't find all that valuable, you should try your best to change that, as it can be rather painful to do somebody else's work or something that's not fun.
I think keeping an open mind too, like I think a lot of places, especially if you choose to do a 1-year fellowship, because it goes quickly, you need to come in with some ideas of what you want to do. And for me, that has been with kind of medical students and residents interacting and giving feedback. However, I will also say, as I was here, I realized there was a huge need for sort of procedural teaching for like our new fellows and new faculty. We realized that the procedural kits, both like central line and TVP kits, were very different from where I did residency, and same thing with chest tubes. And so I actually have a co-fellow, but we've kind of designed a mini just curriculum and really just kind of procedural skill days for faculty at our own institution. So that's been kind of an unexpected project that came up out of a needs assessment and has been fun to kind of develop a mini curriculum, which I think a lot of people do during fellowship as well.
Mm-hmm. I took more of a DEI route during my fellowship. I do a lot of DEI simulation, like hard topics, hard discussions, people from different ethnicities. I feel like there is a need for that. There's not much education during didactics for that, and this is one of the things that it's mostly better taught as a simulation or as a simulation case. Not that everything can be taught as a simulation case, but yeah. So I work basically with actors, and they were embedded participants trying to capture different ethnicities. Trying now to have a standardized curriculum where that's validated by different entities depending on the subject.
Yeah, I think what others have said, basically kind of one of the big tricky components to a project like this is sort of, avoiding scope creep, where it's very easy to kind of attach yourself to a project that, especially for a 1-year program, is not really reasonable or sustainable. But at the same time, kind of a balance between something that you're very interested in versus the realistic expectations for what you're able to achieve, but also, like Christina was saying, kind of a needs assessment. It depends a little bit on your institution about how willing they are to support you and provide resources to help you out with doing something, depending on what they need in their program. But there are just so many different applications that they're almost certainly, even if it's not something that you really thought of beforehand, that you would be able to find something that interests you enough that you're not feeling like you're kind of being dragged through it. So for us, that there were some a lot of curricular development. So like as small or as big as you kind of want to make it. So for like, developing certain simulations for leadership activities and checklists to be used during code scenarios, developing even like simulators, so like using a 3D printer or using innovative construction to create models and then kind of testing it out on certain learner groups. All those sorts of things can be areas that you might be able to create some sort of deliverable or publication from, if you're interested in kind of improving some sort of skill or improving education for your learner group.
Awesome. Well, I think we're approaching the end of our hour. So I want to thank everyone for joining and for providing great questions. And thank you to all the panelists for joining, especially in the evening across different time zones. I think this was really helpful, and definitely reach out to us. Like I said, the simulation world is small. And so if we can help connect you with anyone in a specific area, we probably know them, and we would love to do that to help out and just answer any specific questions. If you realize, a week from now you wished you asked some question, we're happy to answer it via email. So just reach out to us.